Imagine a world where the line between your spiritual life and, well, earthly power was just completely blurred, where the church wasn't just, a religious place, but the absolute center of everything: politics, law, society.
It's hard to picture now, isn't it?
Yeah.
Total dominance.
Right. Now imagine someone trying to bring in the ideas of, say, Aristotle, a pagan philosopher, brilliant, yes, but totally focused on this world, on logic, on how people thrive right here in the city, the Polaire.
Yeah, Aristotle wasn't thinking about salvation or the afterlife in the same way at all. His focus was very much on the natural world, on human flourishing achieved through reason and community here.
Exactly. So how on earth do you take that intensely secular view and weave it together with deep Christian faith, with theology all about God's salvation in the next life? It just sounds impossible.
It really does, like mixing oil and water, doesn't it?
Yep.
You've got the city of God, as Augustine talked about, this focus on our spiritual destiny, and then the earthly city, the here and now. Trying to bridge that gap, that takes, well, a truly monumental intellectual leap.
And yet, someone didn't just try it, they pulled it off so spectacularly that their work basically defined an era. It fundamentally reshaped Western thought for, wow, centuries.
A real game changer.
So our deep dive today, we're jumping into some fascinating excerpts from Western political thought, from Socrates to the age of, and we're zooming in on one of the absolute giants of this story, St. Thomas Aquinas.
Right. And our mission here isn't just to, you know, list facts about Aquinas. We want to really get under the skin of who he was, sure, but also the world he lived in the 13th century. It wasn't static, was it?
No, not at all.
It was buzzing with new ideas, new institutions popping up, a world that you could argue kind of needed the synthesis he came up with. We want to see what that synthesis actually looked like, how he managed to blend Aristotle's philosophy with Christian theology, especially in his political thinking.
And maybe the most compelling part is understanding just how huge this achievement was. Our source is clear. Aquinas didn't just tidy things up academically. He built a bridge between these two seemingly separate worlds of thought. He brought the earthly city, politics, society into a Christian framework in a totally new way.
Which had real consequences for how people understood their place in the world.
Absolutely. It changed how Christians could think about participating in society. But, and this is fascinating, the source also hints at this paradox, that this incredible synthesis, so successful then, actually held the seeds of its own, well, eventual challenge, its own unraveling down the line.
It's a complex legacy.
Yeah.
But yeah, to get Aquinas, you first have to get the 13th century. The state he was operating on was dynamic, full of change, new institutions, old ideas being questioned, and this massive rediscovery happening that was about to shake everything up.
Okay, let's set that stage then. What was medieval society like in the 13th century? Specifically, church power. How had things changed since, say, Augustine's time?
Well, if you think back to Augustine, writing as the Western Roman Empire was crumbling, the church was definitely a rising power, yeah, a source of order, of meaning, and all that chaos.
Yeah.
But institutionally, it was still finding its feet.
Still developing.
Exactly. Fast forward several centuries to the 13th, and wow, the transformation is complete. The source really hammers this home. The church had consolidated power to an incredible degree. It wasn't just about Sunday service. It was the central political, administrative, spiritual, intellectual, and cultural force across Western Europe. Just dominant.
So dominant means way beyond just spiritual guidance. It was actually involved in, like, running things.
Oh, absolutely. Its influence was everywhere. From kings and emperors who the church claimed the authority to crown, even depose right down to the local village. The church had its own sophisticated legal system, canon law.
Right, I've heard of that.
It rivaled secular law and covered huge areas: marriage, contracts, wills, even some crimes. The church owned vast amounts of land. It ran the schools, what few there were. It looked after the poor. It mediated disputes between lords. It was woven into the very fabric of society. The accepted model coming out of that post-Augustinian period was this theocratic top-down model. Authority comes from God, flows through the church hierarchy.
Sounds like challenging the church would be almost unthinkable. It's just everywhere.
Pretty much.
Right.
Its authority felt divinely ordained, covering both the spiritual and a huge chunk of the temporal, the earthly realm. But, and this is crucial, the source points out that even at this peak, cracks were starting to appear. Not open rebellion yet, but the growth of new, more autonomous centers of power.
And one of the big ones the source mentions, universities.
Yes, absolutely vital, especially for the intellectual scene. Think about places like Naples, where Aquinas studied early on, or the University of Paris, the absolute powerhouse where he spent so much time. These weren't just monastery schools anymore, focused only on training monks inside the walls.
They were different somehow.
Yeah, they were developing as distinct corporations. The word universitas originally meant like a guild, you know, a corporation of masters and students.
Ah, okay. Like a trade guild, but for scholars.
Exactly. They had their own rules, their own seals, sometimes charters from kings giving them special rights and protections. Now, they were often still linked to the church, of course, but they fostered this sense of intellectual community, of debate, that was different from the strict hierarchy of a bishop's court or a monastery. They became these incredibly vibrant hubs, attracting scholars from all over Europe. And critically, they provided a new institutional base for intellectual life that wasn't solely under the thumb of the immediate church leadership.
Interesting. And what about those other groups, the independent towns, the guilds for craftsmen?
Yeah, these show society getting more complex, especially as cities and trade started reviving. Towns were getting charters, granting them rights to govern themselves, setting up councils, collecting taxes, running local courts. And the guilds merchants, artisans, they were regulating their own crafts, setting standards, training apprentices, looking after their members.
So it sounds like these groups were starting to manage their own affairs, carving out some independence from the old feudal lords or the church's direct control.
That's exactly it. It represents a shift towards more local, sometimes more horizontal ways of organizing things compared to the strict vertical ladder of feudalism and the church. Now, they weren't usually challenging the ultimate authority of the king or the pope in a big way, not yet, but just by existing and governing themselves, they added layers, new centers of decision-making. The source even mentions that the outlines of the modern nation-state, which would eventually centralize power and challenge the church's temporal role, were just starting to faintly appear then.
And alongside all this institutional change, the source mentions something really intriguing: medieval populism. That term feels so modern.
It does, yeah. But the source uses it carefully to capture this specific idea bubbling up. It's not democracy as we know it, obviously, no voting booths or parliaments.
Yeah.
But the source sees these demands for self-governance, this growing sense that political participation should connect to the community itself. It talks about an inchoate, this beginning, not fully formed belief among people that government should, in some sense, originate with them.
So a feeling that rulers need some kind of buy-in, some connection to the people they're governing.
Exactly. An early glimmer of the idea that the community itself has a stake in how it's run, which is a pretty direct challenge to that pure theocratic top-down model, where authority just flows downwards from God through the Pope and kings with no real need for consent from below. So you've got these stirrings of populism, plus the universities, plus the guilds and towns. It creates this really dynamic, complex world, and it needed new intellectual tools to understand it all.
Which leads us perfectly to the biggest intellectual earthquake of the time, the recovery of Aristotle.
Oh, yeah. This is where the ground really shifts. Our source doesn't mince words. Getting hold of ancient knowledge, especially Aristotle's complete works, was perhaps the most important change, certainly in terms of political theory in this whole period. And how it happened is quite a story.
It came via the Arab world, you said.
Yes, it's such a crucial point. After the Western Roman Empire collapsed, a lot of classical Greek learning, philosophy, science, literature just vanished from Western Europe. But it wasn't lost entirely. It was preserved, studied, even expanded on by scholars in the Byzantine Empire, and especially in the incredibly vibrant intellectual centers of the Islamic world. Thinkers like Avicenna, Averroes, they were major commentators on Aristotle, weaving his thought into Islamic philosophy.
So while Europe was in what we sometimes call the Dark Ages, Islamic scholars were keeping classical thought alive and building on it.
That's right. So when European scholars in the 12th and 13th century started having more contact with the Arab world, especially in places like Spain during the Reconquista or Sicily, they stumbled upon this incredible treasure trove of lost knowledge. And they began this huge project of translating these texts, mostly from Arabic, sometimes directly from Greek, into Latin.
And before this, Western thinkers only knew Aristotle secondhand, kind of.
Pretty much. They knew fragments, often filtered through Roman writers like Cicero, or mentioned by early church fathers like Augustine. But Augustine himself didn't have Aristotle's major works, particularly the Politics. So their understanding was patchy, incomplete, sometimes just plain wrong. And then suddenly, boom, the whole system, the full logical thought of Aristotle becomes available in Latin.
And the source claims this triggered a rebirth of Western consciousness that laid the groundwork for the modern world. That sounds massive.
It is a huge claim, but you can see why. Aristotle offered this complete, logical, systematic way of understanding reality. Everything from physics and biology to ethics and politics, all based on observation and reason. It gave people a framework to understand the natural world and human society without necessarily needing divine revelation at every step. His system was incredibly robust and, as the source points out, it seemed tailor-made for dealing with those new social realities. We're talking about the complex cities, the guilds, the universities, those calls for self-governance.
Because his philosophy kind of validated the natural world and human activity within it.
Precisely. His political science especially was powerful. He argued humans are naturally political animals, meant to live in communities in the polis. And political activity isn't some unfortunate necessity, it's essential for human flourishing, for achieving virtue. He defended the city-state as the place where people could really develop their potential through citizenship, participation. That resonated deeply in a world where towns and associations were starting to flex their muscles. Adopting Aristotle gave a rational, philosophical justification for these new institutions and the whole idea of community self-governance.
So, in a way, embracing Aristotle initially helped thinkers, maybe even the church to some extent, make sense of and kind of align with these changes.
Yes, it offered a powerful, coherent alternative to the more dominant Augustinian view, which often saw earthly politics as primarily a result of sin, a necessary evil just to keep order. Aristotle provided a philosophical system that could accommodate, even legitimize, the growing importance of the secular sphere, of human institutions beyond just the church hierarchy.
But hang on, there's a massive tension here, isn't there? The source says Aristotle's philosophy was essentially secular.
And that's the core paradox. This is what medieval thinkers, and Aquinas above all, had to wrestle with. Aristotle explained the world and human purpose based purely on reason and observation. The goal of his politics was achieving the good life in this world. His system didn't inherently need God or grace or the church.
And church leaders spotted this potential problem.
Oh, absolutely. The source says they initially sensed the potential danger. If you have this powerful, self-contained secular philosophy that can explain everything, where does that leave faith? Revelation? The church's spiritual authority? The source mentions they even tried banning Aristotle's works sometimes. They correctly saw that this secular framework could eventually be used to question or even attack the church's claim to ultimate supremacy, both spiritual and temporal.
But they couldn't keep him out. The resistance failed.
According to the source, yeah, it failed. His ideas were just too powerful, too compelling, and too well-suited to the emerging populism of the late medieval world. They offered answers, a framework that just clicked with the times. There was no holding them back. The sheer intellectual force and scope of Aristotle's work made him irresistible to scholars in the new universities, and his ideas about community resonated with the changing society. Medieval thinkers had to engage with Aristotle. Ignoring him just wasn't an option anymore.
Okay, so the stage is set. A powerful church, new institutions rising, this potentially disruptive philosophy arrives. Enter the man who tries to reconcile it all, St. Thomas Aquinas.
Right. Described by the source as generally recognized as the greatest thinker Catholicism ever produced. And his system, Thomism, is still incredibly influential in Catholic thought.
Born 1225, died 1274, came from a noble family but chose a different path, joined the Dominicans, an order focused on study and preaching.
And crucially, his path took him right into those new intellectual hotspots, the universities. Naples first, then the big one, Paris. And it was in Paris he met his key mentor, Albert the Great.
Albert the Great, the source calls him one of the greatest scholars of Aristotle in the Western world.
Albert was huge. He was a pioneer in systematically studying and teaching Aristotle's entire body of work within a Christian context. The source says Albert molded St. Thomas's whole intellectual life. Just imagine learning about this incredibly complex, powerful, potentially dangerous secular philosophy from someone who had already spent years mastering it and thinking through its implications for Christianity.
So Aquinas wasn't tackling Aristotle cold. He had a guide, someone who saw the potential.
Exactly. That mentorship was crucial. It gave Aquinas the deep grounding in Aristotle he needed to even attempt his massive project, integrating this comprehensive secular system into Christian faith. It enabled him, as the source puts it, to carry out a revolution in medieval thought.
Right, let's get into that revolution, starting with his political theory. The source says it closely parallels Aristotle's.
It really does. You read Aquinas on politics, and Aristotle is just everywhere. His main political work on kingship or de regno. The source notes a little scholarly quibble about whether he wrote every single word of the text we have, but the core ideas are definitely his or from his school, and it largely tracks Aristotle's politics in structure and argument.
So how does he echo Aristotle at that fundamental level? What's the starting point?
He starts with the exact same idea about human nature and the state. He takes Aristotle's famous line, "It is natural for man to be a social and political animal, to live in a group." Now, that's a massive departure from the Augustinian focus on sin-making government necessary. For Aquinas, political community isn't a punishment or a fix for the fall.
Hmm.
It's part of human nature as God designed it.
And the implication of that is?
Well, if political life is natural, then political activity is both necessary and good. It's not just some regrettable necessity to control bad behavior. It's a positive sphere where humans can actually fulfill their potential.
And he also links this political nature to reason and speech, just like Aristotle did.
Yes, he grounds our political life in those unique human capacities. Our ability to reason and to speak. These are the tools we use to deliberate, form communities, make laws, pursue common goals. And following Aristotle's teleological thinking, the idea that everything has an inherent purpose or end it's striving for.
Right, the telos.
Exactly. Aquinas argues that it's through reasoned action within the political community that people achieve virtue and therefore happiness and fulfillment in this life. The state provides the necessary context for that moral development.
So the state's purpose is fundamentally moral, not just about keeping the peace.
Absolutely. Like Aristotle, Aquinas sees the state's end, its purpose, as the moral good of its members. It's about creating the conditions for virtuous living. And that means the state has to be based on justice, and the rulers, ideally, the best people, should rule for the common good, constrained by law.
And he even borrows Aristotle's way of classifying governments.
Yep, takes the same framework. Classifies constitutions based on quantity, how many rulers, one, few, many, and quality, whether they rule for the common good or just for themselves.
Okay, so far it sounds very Aristotelian. Where does Aquinas start putting his own distinctively Christian spin on things?
Well, one place you see it is in his argument for the best form of government. Like Aristotle, he thinks monarchy is theoretically the best. But while Aristotle had practical, secular reasons of efficiency, Unity Aquinas adds a uniquely Christian layer. He says, look, the entire universe is governed monarchically by God. That divine rule provides a clear model for how earthly communities should be governed.
Okay, using a divine analogy. But the source flags a really important nuance here.
Yes, and this is key to understanding how his synthesis works. Aquinas is careful not to push his divine analogy too far. He gets that earthly politics has its own worldly logic and dynamics. Human rulers aren't God, political rule isn't the same as God's perfect cosmic rule, and you can't just map supernatural analogies directly onto the messy realities of human government.
So he doesn't just rely on the God is king model.
Exactly. He also defends monarchy on strictly secular grounds, arguing it's more effective at promoting unity, preventing faction, practical reasons any secular thinker might use. And importantly, just like Aristotle, while monarchy might be the theoretical ideal, Aquinas recognizes that in the real world, the best possible or most stable government is often a mixed regime blending elements of monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy, or polity, as Aristotle called the good form of rule by the many. This shows he's grappling with practical politics, using Aristotle's empirical approach, even while holding on to his theological framework.
Okay, so he's adopting Aristotle's structure, but subtly weaving in Christian reasons and priorities. But the really deep synthesis, the one that tackles that core tension between nature and spirit, must go deeper than just classifying governments, right?
Oh, absolutely. What we've talked about is kind of the surface level of his political thought. It rests on a much deeper philosophical integration. Aquinas incorporates Aristotle's metaphysics, his fundamental understanding of reality. Things like form being immanent in matter.
Meaning the essence of a thing is in the physical thing, not some separate ideal form like Plato thought.
Right, and the idea that things move from potentiality to actuality, striving to reach their full potential, their perfection.
And how does that connect to politics?
Because Aquinas, like Aristotle, is a teleologist. Everything has a purpose, an end. And he adopts Aristotle's view that the state, the political community, is the highest end of our social life. It's the ultimate form or actualization of how humans live together. It's within the state that we can fully realize our potential as social and political beings.
But here's the big twist. He infuses this with spirituality.
This is the absolute core of his genius, the heart of the synthesis. He doesn't just take Aristotle's naturalism neat. He grounds that teleological naturalism, the idea that nature has inherent purposes within a much larger Christian system that includes spiritual dimension, a spiritual destiny for humankind. He blends Aristotelian naturalism with Christian spiritualism.
And that's what allows him to finally overcome Augustine's dualism.
Yes, exactly. By showing that the natural realm, including politics, society, human reason, has a legitimate, positive place within God's larger spiritual plan, he can embrace Aristotle's political philosophy in good Christian conscience. He moves past the Augustinian tendency to see earthly politics as fundamentally tainted by sin, a necessary evil at best.
So he's really tackling the huge underlying questions of his time.
Totally. On one level, he's solving the practical political problem. What's the appropriate relationship of church and state? How should these two massive powers coexist? But underneath that, he's resolving the deeper philosophical and theological issue. How can our natural capacities, our ability to reason, socialize, build cities, fit with our spiritual destiny, our ultimate goal of salvation and union with God? How can you be fully human and fully Christian at the same time?
And the answer, the crucial link he finds between these two realms, is reason.
That's the key insight. Augustine had struggled here. He saw humans as both natural and spiritual, but ultimately viewed earth and politics as corrupt, disconnected from salvation. Aquinas finds the bridge.
Reason, which, okay, was already seen as what makes humans human, separates us from animals, central to ancient philosophy, the Stoics.
Right. It has a long pedigree in Western thought. But Aquinas does something new. He gives reason genuine spiritual content that goes beyond what Aristotle saw. For Aristotle, reason made us rational animals, elevated us above biology. For Aquinas, reason elevates us not just above biology, but above nature itself.
How does he argue that?
Because for Aquinas, reason unites human beings directly with God. Our ability to think logically, to understand truth and goodness, isn't just a biological function. It's a spark of the divine within us. It's how we, as finite creatures, can grasp aspects of the infinite truth, goodness, and order that exist perfectly in God's own mind.
And he spells this out most clearly in his theory of law, in his huge work, the Summa Theologica.
Yes, the Summa is where you see the practical payoff of the synthesis. His theory of law, especially natural law, is foundational. He outlines 4 levels of law, all linked by reason, because law, for Aquinas following Aristotle, is fundamentally a rule based on reason for the common good. The different levels just represent different sources or applications of reason.
Okay, let's unpack those levels. Take us through them.
Right. At the very top, there's eternal law. This is God's own divine reason, the ultimate wisdom that orders the entire cosmos. It's the blueprint for everything. We can't fully grasp it because it's, well, God's infinite mind.
Okay, the cosmic master plan.
Then below that, you have divine law. This is the part of the eternal law that God has specifically revealed to humans, mainly through Scripture, I think the 10 Commandments, the teachings of Jesus. It's like God giving us specific instructions from the blueprint.
Got it. Revealed truths.
Next, and this is absolutely crucial for politics, is natural law. This is the moral law that humans can discover using their own innate reason, without needing special revelation like Scripture. It's our built-in capacity as rational beings to figure out fundamental ethical principles.
So, things like knowing murder is wrong, or that we should be fair to each other just by thinking about it, using our conscience.
Exactly. Those are dictates of natural law. Aquinas argues our reason can grasp these basic goods because, as rational creatures, we inherently participate in God's eternal reason. The source actually calls him the greatest natural law theorist since the Stoics, who also talked about a universal moral law discoverable by reason.
And the 4th level?
That's human law or civil law. These are the specific concrete laws made by human societies and governments to organize daily life, traffic laws, tax codes, property regulations, stuff like that.
Okay. Now, what makes Aquinas' take on natural law so unique and central to his synthesis? You said it links the natural and the supernatural?
Precisely. This is where it all comes together. For Aquinas, natural law isn't just humans cleverly figuring things out on their own. It is, and this is a key phrase from the source quoting Aquinas, the rational creature's participation of the eternal law.
Participation. What does that really mean here? Like, we get a little piece of God's reason.
Kind of. It means when we use our reason correctly to understand moral truth, that kindness is good, theft is bad, our reason isn't just operating in a vacuum. It's literally sharing in it. It's reflecting a part of God's own perfect ordering reason that governs the universe. Our moral reasoning ability is an extension of a spiritual principle that transcends the purely physical world.
Wow. So using reason to act ethically isn't just a good human thing to do. It's also, in a way, a spiritual act.
That's exactly the implication. When people follow reason in their dealings with each other and how they structure society, their actions have both a natural dimension, human activity, and a spiritual dimension. It aligns with and participates in God's eternal order. This is how Aquinas builds the bridge. Our capacity for reason, which is part of our natural makeup, is simultaneously the way we connect to the spiritual realm.
The political consequences of that idea that human laws, through natural law, connect back to divine law must be huge.
Oh, they're transformative. The immediate result is that human law, the laws governments make, gets its legitimacy, its moral weight, from the extent to which it aligns with natural law, with that universal moral reason. And if it does align, then human law itself becomes a reflection, however imperfect, of God's eternal law. So civil law isn't just about power or keeping order. It gains real spiritual significance.
Which means politics itself is no longer this suspect, maybe even corrupt realm, but something worthwhile.
Absolutely. From a Christian viewpoint, politics suddenly becomes an important and worthy endeavor. It's not just about earthly flourishing like Aristotle thought. It's connected to people's spiritual well-being, because acting justly in the political sphere is acting in accordance with God's law. The political realm is now seen as compatible with spirituality, even conducive to it.
And the source draws this really striking conclusion from that.
Yeah, it's revolutionary for the time. Being a good citizen now becomes part of being a good Christian. That completely flips the old Augustinian separation, where being a good citizen of Rome seemed pretty irrelevant to being a citizen of the city of God. Aquinas says, no, your earthly political life, if lived according to reason and justice, can be a positive part of your journey toward salvation.
So politics, political theory, they get back the kind of importance they had in classical Greece, but now they're firmly embedded within a Christian understanding of the world.
Exactly. That famous question attributed to Augustine, what does it matter under whose government a dying man lives? Which really emphasized the seeming irrelevance of earthly rule for ultimate salvation. That question loses its sting in Aquinas' framework. Political life does matter for the Christian.
This feels like more than just intellectual adjustment. It sounds like a massive psychological shift in how Christians thought about human nature itself, especially compared to Augustine's focus on sin.
It really is. The source points directly to psychology as a core difference. For Augustine, because of original sin, the defining feature of fallen humanity is sinfulness. Our nature is so corrupted that reason is weak, easily swayed by bad desires, even used for evil.
It's a pretty bleak view of human potential.
It is. But Aquinas, while absolutely acknowledging sin is real, he's a mainstream Christian theologian, after all, refuses to say sin is the defining characteristic. For Aquinas, reason, not sin, is what fundamentally makes us human. Yes, we're sinful, but that's not the whole story. We also have the capacity to choose not to sin, and our God-given reason is a powerful tool to help us understand the good and guide our lives towards virtue.
And what's his theological basis for being more optimistic about reason?
Well, he'd argue God put reason in us. It's part of his creation. So to say reason is fundamentally broken, unreliable for doing good, almost sounds like doubting God's own work within us. Reason is a divine gift, and using it properly aligns us with God's order.
So by tying reason so tightly to the spiritual uniting nature and spirit, he managed this incredible reconciliation of Aristotle and Christianity.
Yes. The source calls it an enormous practical effect. This linkage allowed Aquinas to take Aristotle's political theory with its focus on natural community, virtue in this life, the state fostering flourishing, and use it with a clear Christian conscience. He could defend the legitimacy of the state, universities, guilds, not just as practical things, but as part of God's natural order, conducive to human well-being, both earthly and, ultimately, spiritual.
But even within this harmonious picture, there's still a definite hierarchy, right? The spiritual isn't just equal to the natural.
Oh, absolutely not. Crucial point. While he showed the harmony, Aquinas fully upheld the traditional Christian view. The supernatural is higher than the natural. Spirit is superior to nature. Reason elevates natural activities like politics, gives them spiritual worth, but reason alone can't get you to the highest spiritual existence that requires God's grace, revealed faith. Reason lets us participate in the divine, but it doesn't make us God's equal.
And maintaining this hierarchy was essential for defending the ultimate superiority of the church.
Yes, and the Force calls this a sine qua non, basically a non-negotiable condition for his theory to fly in the 13th century. The church, as the guardian of faith and grace, representing the supernatural realm, remained the spiritual center. It held ultimate authority on fundamental moral and spiritual questions.
But at the same time, he strongly defended the state's legitimacy within its own proper area.
This is the balancing act. He argued the state has its own legitimate realm. Just because the church is spiritually superior doesn't mean it should be running everything day to day. The sacred sphere, the church, and the secular sphere, state, each have their appropriate spheres of action. And critically, both spheres are willed by God, part of his divine intelligence. It's not good versus evil, but a hierarchy of different legitimate domains. The state handles earthly peace, justice for crime, infrastructure, commerce, things needed for this life. The church handles faith, sacraments, guiding souls to the next life.
And he used the same kind of distinct but united hierarchical logic when talking about faith and reason themselves.
Exactly the same pattern. Faith is superior to reason because faith grasps truths beyond reason's reach, like the Trinity or the Incarnation. But reason is a, quote, legitimate and necessary corollary to faith. It's not faith's enemy, it's its partner. This is a big deal, given how suspicious much of the Christian tradition had been towards reason, often linking it to pride or the fall.
Yeah, Augustine's distrust of reason fed into that long debate. Theologians stressing faith alone versus philosophers thinking reason could prove everything.
Right. Aquinas offers a middle way, a synthesis. Faith is supreme, yes, and needed for ultimate truths. But reason is an autonomous good, valuable in its own right, capable of discovering truth within its own sphere, nature, ethics, politics. He thought both extremes were wrong, those who thought reason explained everything and those who dismissed reason entirely. They failed, he argued, to see both the distinction and the ultimate unity between faith and reason, just like people misunderstood the natural-supernatural relationship.
So, the grand result of this entire intricate synthesis is what the source describes as Aquinas liberating medieval thought from Augustine's powerful metaphor of the two cities.
Once and for all, the source says. And this liberation wasn't just about church and state relations. It was about resolving that deeper split between our spiritual and natural sides.
He basically brought the earthly city, politics, philosophy, science, human community inside the tent, incorporating it into a larger Christian worldview.
Exactly. And think about the implications. For ordinary Christians, it meant you didn't have to feel like engaging with the world. Politics, learning, community building was somehow suspect, a distraction from salvation. It could be a legitimate, even valuable part of a Christian life. And for thinkers, political philosophers, it meant they didn't have to look only to theology or revelation for political ideas.
They were freed up to analyze politics using reason, observation, the natural world, kind of like Aristotle did.
Pretty much. With one absolutely crucial condition. They had to give formal recognition to the principle that spiritual values are higher than political values. As long as that basic hierarchy was respected, the theorists could analyze politics from a secular point of view. Look at the state's natural goals, practical governance, earthly justice, using reason. That's why Aquinas can make both theological arguments and strictly secular arguments for monarchy side by side.
It's a really striking parallel the source makes. Just as Aristotle freed political thinking from Plato's focus on a separate world of ideal forms, Aquinas freed it from the grip of Augustine's stark dualism between the earthly and heavenly cities.
It brought the focus back to the possibility of achieving real good in this world through human reason and effort, guided by faith. It made politics important again and gave theorists the intellectual tools to analyze the real world of political life in a comprehensive way, something that hadn't really been central since classical times.
Aquinas' synthesis sounds incredibly robust, almost perfectly designed for the 13th century world he lived in.
It was, and it held sway for a long time. The source points out its big advantages. It made sense of the complexities of late medieval life. It opened up new avenues for thought, and it offered this grand, unified vision connecting nature and spirit, church and state, ethics and politics, using the best of both classical philosophy and Christian theology.
In this whole tradition, running from Socrates through Aristotle and Aquinas, it shared some fundamental ideas, didn't it?
Yes, despite all the variations, the source argues these thinkers operated within a common tradition of discourse. And the absolute core, the unifying thread, was the presumed unity of ethics and politics. They basically all assumed, in one way or another, that the main point of politics was to create the conditions for people to live good, ethical, fulfilled lives.
So political science wasn't just about power or administration, it was fundamentally a moral science.
Exactly. It was about how to structure collective life to achieve moral flourishing, both for individuals and the community. And linked to that were other shared ideas. That reason is key to figuring out ethical truth, whether it's Socrates' concepts, Aristotle's practical wisdom, or Aquinas' natural law, that humans are naturally social, not self-sufficient, and that the community and its institutions are vital for improving human life. This whole way of thinking, linking politics tightly to ethics and human flourishing, really culminated in thinkers like Aristotle, Cicero, and Aquinas.
But the source throws a curveball here, suggesting that even in this magnificent structure Aquinas built, there was an inherent weakness.
Yes, and this is where the narrative starts to turn towards the modern era, towards the breakdown of this long-standing tradition. The source makes a really critical observation. Aquinas' synthesis, for all its power, was essentially artificial.
Artificial? That sounds harsh. Why artificial?
Because, the source explains, there was nothing to prevent the theorist from eliminating the Christian element and returning to a purely secular Aristotelianism once the power of the church began to be challenged. In other words, the secular philosophical engine he borrowed from Aristotle was powerful enough that it could, potentially, run on its own without the spiritual chassis Aquinas built around it.
Ah, I see. He built this amazing bridge, but the secular side he used was strong enough that it could eventually just detach itself.
That's the idea. The synthesis worked brilliantly as long as the church's spiritual authority and its role in setting moral boundaries for politics was broadly accepted. But as secular powers, especially the emerging states, got stronger and started asserting their own absolute authority, the purely secular arguments Aquinas himself had used could be taken out of context, stripped of their theological framing, and used against the church's political influence.
And this is how the source describes the beginning of the assault of modern thought.
Yes, it frames the shift to modern political thinking as no less than a full-scale assault upon this whole tradition of discourse that stretched from Socrates to Aquinas. And the first step, according to the source, was an attack specifically on Aquinas' synthesis.
Beginning by de-Christianizing Aristotle.
Meaning thinkers took Aristotle's ideas about the state being natural, self-sufficient, aimed at earthly good, and used them to argue for the state's total supremacy on purely secular grounds. They essentially said the state doesn't need the church's guidance or interference. In fact, the church's political power is illegitimate. The source mentions Marsilius of Padua's book, Defensor Pacis, Defender of Peace, from the early 14th century as a prime example, using Aristotle to argue for the absolute power of the secular ruler, pushing the church completely under state control.
Wow. Using the very tools Aquinas had integrated, but now weaponizing the secular part against the spiritual part he'd tried to harmonize it with.
Precisely. Taking the Aristotelian toolkit that Aquinas had baptized, if you like, and using it to build a purely secular state theory. And then, later on, modern thought got even more radical, eventually ditching Aristotle altogether and building new political philosophies on entirely different foundations.
And the end result of this whole unraveling process?
The source says it led to radically secular political theories. A new kind of dualism emerged, almost the mirror image of Augustine's, but this time it was the heavenly city, the spiritual dimension, that faded away or became irrelevant for many political thinkers.
And the key thing that got lost in this shift?
The presumed unity of ethics and politics largely disappeared along with it. If politics isn't fundamentally about cultivating virtue or aiming at a higher moral good, what is it about? Security, power, individual rights, economics. That's the massive shift marking the transition to modern political thought.
So Aquinas builds this incredible, complex bridge connecting the earthly and the heavenly, the ethical and the political, but the very secular materials he used to strengthen the earthly side eventually helped pull the whole structure apart, leading to a politics disconnected from that higher moral purpose.
It's a profound irony, isn't it? A complex legacy.
Wow, that's quite a sweep of history, from Augustine's crumbling world to the doorstep of modernity, all pivoting around Aquinas. Let's just quickly pull together his huge achievement.
Yeah, St. Thomas Aquinas really stands out as the great synthesizer. He managed to weave together classical philosophy, especially Aristotle, with Christian theology, navigating that really complex, changing medieval world. His genius was incorporating the earthly city, politics, reason, society into a coherent Christian framework, showing political life could be both natural and spiritually meaningful.
And for you listening, the key things to take away from this deep dive are pretty fundamental for understanding how Western thought developed. Think about how Aquinas made politics seem legitimate, even important from a Christian perspective, tying it to spiritual well-being. Remember that crucial role he gave to reason as the bridge connecting our natural abilities to God's divine order.
And his idea of natural law, not just as ethics, but as our actual participation in God's eternal reason, giving human law a kind of divine grounding. And don't forget that really revolutionary idea for his time, that being a good citizen, participating justly in your community, could actually be part of being a good Christian, part of your path to salvation.
This whole synthesis Aquinas build profoundly shaped how the West wrestled with faith and reason, church and state, the individual and the community for centuries afterwards. It set the terms for so many later debates.
It really did. You can't understand what came next without understanding Aquinas.
Okay, and here's a final thought to leave you with, building on our discussion. Our source calls Aquinas' synthesis essentially artificial, remember? Because those secular Aristotelian parts could be detached from the Christian framework. And that detachment eventually contributed to losing that assumed link between ethics and politics in a lot of modern thought.
Which brings up a really big question, one that arguably still echoes today. When that foundational idea, the idea that politics is fundamentally a moral enterprise aimed at human flourishing within a larger moral order, when that starts to break down, when politics gets viewed mainly as being about power or pragmatism or economics, divorced from any higher ethical or spiritual purpose.
What does that actually mean for how we understand what government is for? What are its limits and what fills that gap? If politics isn't aiming for virtue or the common good in that comprehensive classical medieval sense, what becomes the guiding principle for our life together as a community? What might be lost when the earthly city loses its connection to any sense of a higher purpose?
It's part of the enduring, complex legacy of Aquinas' attempt to hold those two worlds together. Definitely something worth pondering.
Indeed. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into St. Thomas Aquinas and the Great Synthesis.